The emergency room at Atlanta General Hospital was having its usual busy afternoon. Nurses rushed between beds, doctors checked charts, and the familiar beeping of medical monitors filled the air. It was just another Wednesday in July, with the summer heat making everyone a little more irritable than usual. Around 3:30 p.m., something happened that made the entire emergency room stop in its tracks. Through the sliding glass doors burst a young black girl, no more than 12 years old, her braids swinging wildly as she ran. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the girl herself, it was what she was carrying. In her arms was a tiny white baby wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. "Please, somebody help," the girl cried out, her voice cracking with emotion. "The baby's really hot and she won't stop crying." For a moment, nobody moved. The scene before them seemed to defy explanation. The contrast between the dark-skinned preteen and the fair-skinned infant created a picture that made several staff members exchange questioning looks. Even Mrs. Chen, the experienced head nurse who had seen everything in her 20 years at the hospital, found herself momentarily frozen. The baby's weak cry snapped everyone back to reality. Two nurses quickly approached, while the receptionist picked up her phone, her finger hovering over the security button. The young girl's eyes were wide with fear, but not for herself. All her concern was focused on the tiny bundle in her arms. "She's been like this for hours," the girl explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I tried putting cool cloths on her head like my mom does when we're sick, but it's not working. Please, you have to help her." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. As one nurse gently took the baby from her arms, another led her to a nearby chair. The infant's skin was flushed and hot to the touch, prompting immediate action from the medical team. Dr. Roberts, who had been updating charts at the nurses' station, walked over to assess the situation. He was a tall man with kind eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses, but even he couldn't hide his curiosity about the unusual circumstances. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked, pulling up a chair to sit at eye level with the girl. "I'm Maria," she replied, twisting the hem of her t-shirt nervously in her hands. "The baby's name is Sophie. I was watching her when she started getting really hot." The doctor nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "And where are Sophie's parents, Maria?" Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she sat up straighter in her chair. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. Her mom is hurt too. She's still at our apartment building. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't carry them both." The emergency room staff exchanged glances again, but this time they were different, looks of concern rather than suspicion. The story was beginning to make more sense, though many questions remained unanswered. As nurses worked to bring down Sophie's temperature, others gathered around Maria, offering her water and gentle reassurance. The security guard who had been called now stood back, his services clearly not needed. Instead of potential trouble, he was witnessing something else entirely, a young girl's brave attempt to save a life. The initial shock of Maria's entrance had given way to purposeful activity. Medical staff moved with practiced efficiency, checking the baby's vital signs and starting necessary treatments. Through it all, Maria sat watchfully, her eyes never leaving the small form of baby Sophie. An older nurse noticed Maria's hands trembling and brought her a juice box and some crackers. "When was the last time you ate, sweetheart?" she asked kindly. Maria shook her head, barely glancing at the snack. "I'm not hungry. I just need to know if Sophie's going to be okay. And someone needs to help her mom." Her words carried such urgency that Dr. Roberts immediately began organizing a second team to send to the apartment building. As he made the necessary calls, he couldn't help but glance back at Maria, still sitting anxiously in her chair, showing a level of responsibility and compassion far beyond her years. The afternoon sun streamed through the emergency room windows, creating long shadows on the floor. In the golden light, the scene looked almost surreal, but the emotions were all too real. A young girl's quick thinking and courage had set in motion a chain of events that would soon reveal an even more remarkable story. Nobody in the emergency room that day would soon forget the sight of Maria running through those doors. What had initially appeared suspicious was rapidly transforming into something else entirely, a story of humanity at its finest, where age, race, and assumptions would all take a backseat to the simple act of helping others in need. The minutes following Maria's dramatic entrance to the emergency room were filled with a mix of urgency and uncertainty. While the medical team worked on stabilizing baby Sophie's fever, hushed conversations and concerned glances bounced between the hospital staff. The situation felt like a delicate puzzle where not all the pieces seemed to fit. Dr. Roberts had seen countless emergencies during his 15 years at Atlanta General, but this one was different. As he checked Sophie's vital signs, he couldn't help but notice how the security guard kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure whether to stay or go. The receptionist was on the phone, speaking in low tones, presumably with hospital administration or local authorities. Temperatures at 103.2, called out one of the nurses, pressing a cool compress to Sophie's forehead. The baby's cries had weakened to whimpers, her tiny face flushed with fever. Maria watched from her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, looking much younger than her 12 years. 2 police officers arrived shortly after, their presence adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Officer Chen, a petite woman with a gentle demeanor, approached Maria while her partner spoke with the hospital staff. "Hi there," Officer Chen said, kneeling beside Maria's chair. "Can you tell me a little bit about what happened today?" Maria's eyes darted between the officer and baby Sophie. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to help." The officer's face softened. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble. We just need to understand the situation better. Can you tell me how you came to be taking care of this baby?" As Maria began to explain, more pieces of the puzzle started coming together. She lived in the Pine Grove Apartments, just 3 blocks from the hospital. Sophie and her mom had moved into the apartment next door about 6 months ago. They were new to Atlanta, didn't have any family nearby, and Maria's mom had taken them under her wing. Sophie's mom works from home, Maria explained, gaining confidence as she spoke. "She's really nice. Sometimes when she has important work calls, I watch Sophie for a little while. My mom says it's good practice for when my new baby sister comes." Officer Chen nodded encouragingly, taking notes. "And what happened today?" "I was helping Mrs. Anderson, that's Sophie's mom, with Sophie while she was on a work call. But then she started acting strange." Maria's voice trembled slightly. "She was talking funny, and then she just fell down. I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't move. Sophie was getting really hot, and I didn't know what else to do except bring her here." The second officer, who had been listening nearby, stepped closer. "Did you try calling 911? Maria nodded vigorously. "Yes, but Mrs. Anderson's phone was locked, and ours got disconnected yesterday because Mom said we need to wait until payday to pay the bill." Tears welled up in her eyes again. "I knew the hospital was close, and Sophie was getting worse, so I just ran." The simple honesty in her explanation seemed to affect everyone within earshot. The security guard, who had been hovering uncertainly, finally relaxed his stance. The receptionist set down her phone, her earlier suspicion replaced by concern. Dr. Roberts paused in his examination of Sophie to address the officers. "The baby has a serious fever, possibly due to an ear infection. Maria's quick action in bringing her here was absolutely the right thing to do." As if to confirm his diagnosis, Sophie let out another weak cry. Maria instinctively moved toward her, but stopped herself, looking uncertainly at the officers. Officer Chen smiled reassuringly. "You're not in any trouble, Maria. In fact, you might have saved both Sophie and her mother today. We've got officers heading to your apartment building right now to check on Mrs. Anderson." The tension in the emergency room began to dissolve, replaced by a growing appreciation for the young girl's quick thinking and bravery. The nurses, who had initially kept their distance except when necessary, now offered Maria warm smiles and words of encouragement. The afternoon light continued to stream through the windows, casting long shadows across the emergency room floor. What had started as a scene of confusion and suspicion was transforming into something entirely different, a story of courage, quick thinking, and the power of community bonds that transcend surface differences. As the medical team continued their work, Dr. Roberts couldn't help but reflect on how quickly they had all jumped to conclusions when Maria first burst through those doors. Sometimes, he realized, the simplest explanation was also the most beautiful. A young girl, seeing someone in need, had simply done whatever she could to help. The police officers settled in to wait for news from their colleagues at the apartment building, while the medical staff focused on bringing Sophie's fever under control. Maria remained in her chair, a silent guardian, her worried eyes never straying far from the baby she had brought to safety. The tension in the emergency room shifted dramatically when Maria finally began sharing her story in detail. As medical staff and police officers gathered around, the young girl's voice grew stronger, painting a picture of the events that had led to this moment. Mrs. Anderson moved in next door right after Christmas, Maria explained, accepting a cup of water from a kind-faced nurse. It was snowing that day, and my mom saw her trying to carry boxes and the baby at the same time. That's when we first met Sophie. She was so tiny back then. The simple story of neighborly kindness touched everyone listening. Maria went on to describe how her mother, despite their own struggles, had reached out to the newcomers. They discovered that Mrs. Anderson was starting over in Atlanta, trying to build a new life for herself and Sophie through remote work as a data entry specialist. Mom always says that's what neighbors are for, Maria continued, her eyes bright with sincerity. When Mrs. Anderson has important work calls, I help watch Sophie. She's teaching me all about taking care of babies, which is good because my mom's having another baby soon. Dr. Roberts, who had been listening while checking Sophie's vital signs, smiled encouragingly. You've clearly learned a lot about baby care. Can you tell us exactly what happened today? Maria's face grew serious as she recalled the morning's events. Mrs. Anderson had this big presentation thing on her computer. She seemed okay at first, but then she started acting weird. Her words got all jumbled up and she kept saying she felt dizzy. Maria's hands twisted in her lap as she remembered. Then she just fell. I tried shaking her shoulder like they show on TV, but she wouldn't wake up. Officer Chen leaned forward. That must have been really scary for you. I was scared, Maria admitted, but I was more worried about Sophie. She had been fussy all morning, and when I touched her head, it was so hot. Her voice trembled slightly. I tried doing what my mom does when we're sick, cool washcloths and everything. But Sophie just kept crying, and Mrs. Anderson wouldn't wake up, and I couldn't call anyone. The young girl's voice trailed off as she remembered her moment of decision. I knew the hospital was close. Mom pointed it out once when we were walking to the grocery store. She said it's good to know where it is in case of emergencies. A small, proud smile crossed her face. I wrapped Sophie up really careful, just like Mrs. Anderson showed me. I made sure to support her head and everything. The radiologist, who had paused in passing to listen, wiped away a tear. Someone brought Maria another juice box, which she absent-mindedly sipped while continuing her story. I locked Mrs. Anderson's apartment door. I remembered to do that, she added quickly, looking at the officers. And I ran as fast as I could without bouncing Sophie too much. She was crying so loud, and people were staring, but I just kept running. As Maria spoke, updates arrived from the team sent to check on Mrs. Anderson. They had found her unconscious but alive, exactly as Maria had described. The initial assessment suggested a severe diabetic episode. Her blood sugar had dropped dangerously low during her important presentation. You did everything right, Dr. Roberts assured Maria, patting her shoulder. Absolutely everything. You probably saved both their lives today. The truth of his words seemed to finally sink in, and Maria's composure cracked slightly. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the morning's fear and bravery caught up with her. A nurse quickly wrapped her in a warm blanket, murmuring words of comfort. I just didn't want anything bad to happen to them, Maria whispered. Mrs. Anderson is so nice to us. She helps me with my homework sometimes, and she always has cookies for me when I watch Sophie. She says we're like her Atlanta family. The emergency room staff exchanged glances, many of them now seeing the situation through entirely new eyes. What had initially seemed suspicious was revealed to be a beautiful testament to community, caring, and the bonds that form between neighbors who become family. As if on cue, Sophie's cries became softer as her fever finally began to respond to treatment. Maria's face lit up at the sound, and she looked hopefully at Dr. Roberts. Is she going to be okay? The doctor nodded, his professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. Thanks to you, both Sophie and her mom are going to be just fine. You're quite the hero, young lady. Maria shook her head, embarrassed by the praise. I'm not a hero, she said softly. I just did what anyone would do. That's what neighbors are for, right? Her simple words held a profound truth that touched everyone in the room. In a world often divided by differences, here was a pure example of humanity at its finest. A young girl who saw past all barriers to help a neighbor in need. The tension in the emergency room shifted dramatically when Maria finally began sharing her story in detail. As medical staff and police officers gathered around, the young girl's voice grew stronger, painting a picture of the events that had led to this moment. Mrs. Anderson moved in next door right after Christmas, Maria explained, accepting a cup of water from a kind-faced nurse. It was snowing that day, and my mom saw her trying to carry boxes and the baby at the same time. That's when we first met Sophie. She was so tiny back then. The simple story of neighborly kindness touched everyone listening. Maria went on to describe how her mother, despite their own struggles, had reached out to the newcomers. They discovered that Mrs. Anderson was starting over in Atlanta, trying to build a new life for herself and Sophie through remote work as a data entry specialist. Mom always says that's what neighbors are for, Maria continued, her eyes bright with sincerity. When Mrs. Anderson has important work calls, I help watch Sophie. She's teaching me all about taking care of babies, which is good because my mom's having another baby soon. Dr. Roberts, who had been listening while checking Sophie's vital signs, smiled encouragingly. You've clearly learned a lot about baby care. Can you tell us exactly what happened today? Maria's face grew serious as she recalled the morning's events. Mrs. Anderson had this big presentation thing on her computer. She seemed okay at first, but then she started acting weird. Her words got all jumbled up and she kept saying she felt dizzy. Maria's hands twisted in her lap as she remembered. Then she just fell. I tried shaking her shoulder like they show on TV, but she wouldn't wake up. Officer Chen leaned forward. That must have been really scary for you. I was scared, Maria admitted, but I was more worried about Sophie. She had been fussy all morning, and when I touched her head, it was so hot. Her voice trembled slightly. I tried doing what my mom does when we're sick, cool washcloths and everything. But Sophie just kept crying, and Mrs. Anderson wouldn't wake up, and I couldn't call anyone. The young girl's voice trailed off as she remembered her moment of decision. I knew the hospital was close. Mom pointed it out once when we were walking to the grocery store. She said it's good to know where it is in case of emergencies. A small, proud smile crossed her face. I wrapped Sophie up really careful, just like Mrs. Anderson showed me. I made sure to support her head and everything. The radiologist, who had paused in passing to listen, wiped away a tear. Someone brought Maria another juice box, which she absent-mindedly sipped while continuing her story. I locked Mrs. Anderson's apartment door. I remembered to do that, she added quickly, looking at the officers. And I ran as fast as I could without bouncing Sophie too much. She was crying so loud, and people were staring, but I just kept running. As Maria spoke, updates arrived from the team sent to check on Mrs. Anderson. They had found her unconscious but alive, exactly as Maria had described. The initial assessment suggested a severe diabetic episode. Her blood sugar had dropped dangerously low during her important presentation. You did everything right, Dr. Roberts assured Maria, patting her shoulder. Absolutely everything. You probably saved both their lives today. The truth of his words seemed to finally sink in, and Maria's composure cracked slightly. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the morning's fear and bravery caught up with her. A nurse quickly wrapped her in a warm blanket, murmuring words of comfort. I just didn't want anything bad to happen to them, Maria whispered. Mrs. Anderson is so nice to us. She helps me with my homework sometimes, and she always has cookies for me when I watch Sophie. She says we're like her Atlanta family. The emergency room staff exchanged glances, many of them now seeing the situation through entirely new eyes. What had initially seemed suspicious was revealed to be a beautiful testament to community, caring, and the bonds that form between neighbors who become family. As if on cue, Sophie's cries became softer as her fever finally began to respond to treatment. Maria's face lit up at the sound, and she looked hopefully at Dr. Roberts. Is she going to be okay? The doctor nodded, his professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. Thanks to you, both Sophie and her mom are going to be just fine. You're quite the hero, young lady. Maria shook her head, embarrassed by the praise. I'm not a hero, she said softly. I just did what anyone would do. That's what neighbors are for, right? Her simple words held a profound truth that touched everyone in the room. In a world often divided by differences, he was a pure example of humanity at its finest. A young girl who saw past all barriers to help a neighbor in need. The emergency room transformed into a hub of coordinated activity as two medical teams worked simultaneously to save both Sophie and her mother. The first ambulance team had already been dispatched to the Pine Grove apartments, their sirens wailing through the Atlanta streets as they raced against time. Blood sugars stabilizing, called out a nurse, adjusting Sophie's IV drip. The baby's cries had softened to occasional whimpers, her fever slowly responding to treatment. Maria watched every movement with intense focus, her own exhaustion forgotten in her concern for the infant. Dr. Roberts divided his attention between monitoring Sophie and coordinating with the team at the apartment complex via his radio. The updates came in bursts of medical terminology, but Maria could tell from his expression that things were improving. They've got Mrs. Anderson on a glucose drip, he explained to Maria in simpler terms. That means they're giving her medicine to help her wake up. They'll be bringing her here soon. Maria's shoulders relaxed slightly at the news, so she's going to be okay. Thanks to you, they found her in time, the doctor confirmed. If you hadn't acted so quickly. He left the sentence unfinished, but Maria understood. Her quick thinking had made all the difference. The emergency room doors burst open again as the second team arrived with Mrs. Anderson on a stretcher. Despite her still groggy state, she was already trying to ask about her baby. When she caught sight of Sophie in the nearby treatment area, tears of relief streamed down her face. My baby, she whispered weakly. How did she? Her eyes found Maria, and understanding dawned in her expression. Oh, sweetie, you brought her here. Maria moved closer to Mrs. Anderson's stretcher, suddenly shy. You fell down, and Sophie was so hot, I didn't know what else to do. The medical team worked efficiently around them, connecting monitors and adjusting medication levels. Mrs. Anderson reached out a shaky hand to grasp Maria's. You saved us, she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Roberts joined them, checking Mrs. Anderson's vital signs. Your neighbor here made quite an impression on us today, he said warmly. Not many 12-year-olds would have handled this situation so well. As Mrs. Anderson's condition stabilized, she was able to explain what had happened. She'd been feeling unwell all morning, but had pushed through because of an important work presentation. Being new to diabetes management, she hadn't recognized the warning signs of low blood sugar until it was almost too late. I remember feeling dizzy during the video call, she recalled. After that, everything's a blur until I woke up in the ambulance. The emergency room staff moved Mrs. Anderson's stretcher closer to Sophie's treatment area, allowing the mother to see her baby. The infant's fever had finally broken, and she was sleeping peacefully. The sight brought fresh tears to Mrs. Anderson's eyes. I should have told you about my diabetes, she said to Maria. I didn't want anyone to worry. I thought I could handle it on my own. A nurse checking Mrs. Anderson's glucose levels shook her head gently. Nobody should have to handle everything alone, she said. That's why we have communities, neighbors, friends. The afternoon light was starting to fade outside the hospital windows when Maria's mother finally arrived, having rushed over from her workplace after receiving the police department's message. She burst into the emergency room, her pregnant belly leading the way, and immediately wrapped Maria in a tight hug. My brave, brave girl, she whispered, rocking Maria back and forth. Then she turned to Mrs. Anderson, concern written across her face. How are you feeling? Is there anything you need? The simple question carried the weight of true friendship, and Mrs. Anderson's composure cracked. I don't know what I did to deserve neighbors like you, she said through tears. The medical staff stepped back, giving the families a moment together. They had seen countless emergencies, but this one was special. It wasn't just about medical intervention, it was about the strength of human connections, about a young girl who didn't see differences when someone needed help, about communities coming together in times of crisis. As the day's events wound down, Dr. Roberts made a final check on both patients. Sophie's fever was gone, and Mrs. Anderson's blood sugar levels had stabilized. They would need to stay overnight for observation, but the crisis had passed. "You know," he said to Maria, who was finally showing signs of tiredness, "sometimes the best medicine isn't something we keep in the hospital. Sometimes it's just people caring about each other." Maria's mother squeezed her daughter's shoulder proudly. "That's exactly what I've always tried to teach her," she said. "When someone needs help, you help. Simple as that." The emergency room was returning to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. The story of the young girl who brought a baby to safety would be told and retold, a reminder that in moments of crisis, the differences that seem to divide us mean nothing compared to the humanity that unites us. As the immediate crisis settled, the story of how Mrs. Anderson and Maria's family became neighbors began to unfold in the quiet hospital room. The winter day when Mrs. Anderson first arrived at Pine Grove Apartments had been unusually cold for Atlanta, with a rare dusting of snow making the moving process even more challenging. Maria's mother, sitting in the hospital chair while rubbing her pregnant belly, smiled at the memory. "I saw you from our window, trying to manage those boxes while holding Sophie. I told Maria, 'That lady needs some help,' and down we went." Mrs. Anderson laughed softly from her hospital bed, where Sophie now slept peacefully beside her. "I was so overwhelmed that day. New city, new job, no family around. Then suddenly there you both were, insisting on helping carry boxes and inviting me for hot chocolate." The story continued to emerge, painting a picture of how two families from different backgrounds had woven their lives together through small, everyday kindnesses. There were shared meals when money was tight, babysitting exchanges, and late-night conversations over cups of tea. "Remember when your car wouldn't start?" Maria piped up. "Mom walked to the store in the rain to get Sophie's formula because you were worried about running out." "And remember when you helped me set up my work-from-home office?" Mrs. Anderson countered. "Your mom knew exactly how to arrange everything so I could keep an eye on Sophie while working." Dr. Roberts, stopping by for another checkup, found himself drawn into the conversation. "So this is more than just a neighbor helping out occasionally," he observed. "Much more," Maria's mother agreed. "When you're far from family, you learn to make family wherever you can find it." Mrs. Anderson helps Maria with her math homework. Lord knows I'm terrible at fractions. And she's been teaching me all about using computers properly. Mrs. Anderson wiped away a tear. "And you've both been teaching me about being a single mom. I was so scared when I first moved here, trying to figure everything out on my own, but you never let me feel alone." The nurse checking vitals smiled as she listened. "I think a lot of people could learn from your story," she said. "These days, it seems like everyone's so focused on differences." Maria, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up. "Mom says differences are just on the outside. Like Sophie has light hair and I have dark hair, but we both love playing peekaboo and reading stories." The simple wisdom of her words made the adults exchange knowing looks. Mrs. Anderson reached out to squeeze Maria's hand. "You're right, sweetie. And you proved that today more than ever." The conversation turned to how their friendship had grown over the months. Mrs. Anderson had become a regular at their Sunday dinners, bringing her famous apple pie. Maria's mother shared her secret recipe for cornbread, passed down from her grandmother. They celebrated holidays together, creating new traditions that blended their different backgrounds. Sophie took her first steps in our living room, Maria remembered proudly, right between our coffee table and the couch. "And Maria was the first person she reached for other than me," Mrs. Anderson added. "I have a video of it somewhere. She just kept saying, 'Ria, Ria.'" The afternoon wore on, and more hospital staff found reasons to stop by the room, drawn by the warmth and laughter emanating from within. Each visitor heard another piece of the story, about holiday celebrations, shared struggles, and countless small moments of connection. "I've been teaching Mrs. Anderson to braid hair," Maria announced. "She says when Sophie's hair gets longer, she wants to learn how to do all the pretty styles like mine. And she's been teaching me about gardening," Mrs. Anderson added. "Did you know Maria's family has a whole vegetable garden on their balcony? They're growing tomatoes and peppers and herbs." Dr. Roberts, making his final rounds, paused in the doorway. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in all my years of medicine, I've learned that healing isn't just about medications and procedures. It's about having people who care about you, who show up when you need them." Maria's mother nodded. "That's what community is supposed to be. not just living next to each other, but living with each other, sharing the good times and the hard times. As evening approached, the hospital room had become a testament to the power of looking beyond surface differences to find the shared humanity underneath. The story of these two families, brought together by chance and bonded by choice, served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the strongest families are the ones we create for ourselves. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Atlanta, casting a warm glow across the city. In that light, the simple truth was clear: love, friendship, and community know no boundaries when hearts are open to connection. As news of the day's events spread throughout the hospital, the story began to capture the attention of local media. A reporter from the Atlanta Daily News arrived first, drawn by what she'd heard from a friend who worked as a nurse in the emergency room. The reporter, a gentle-spoken woman with kind eyes, sat quietly in the corner of the hospital room, taking notes as she watched the natural interaction between the two families. What struck her most wasn't just the dramatic rescue, but the genuine warmth and connection that radiated between them. "Would you mind sharing your story?" she asked softly after introducing herself. "I think it's something people need to hear right now." Mrs. Anderson glanced at Maria and her mother, who both nodded encouragingly. "As long as you tell it right," Maria's mother said. "Not just about today, but about how we became family." The reporter listened intently as they recounted everything, from that first snowy day of moving in, through months of shared meals and babysitting, leading up to Maria's brave run to the hospital. Her pen moved quickly across her notepad, capturing not just the facts but the emotion behind them. "You know what's remarkable?" the reporter said, pausing in her writing. "In all the time I've been here, neither of you has mentioned anything about race or background. You just talk about being neighbors, being family." "Because that's what matters," Maria piped up from where she sat next to Sophie's crib. "Mrs. Anderson says family is about love, not about what people look like." The hospital staff who had been involved in the emergency continued to stop by throughout the evening, each one adding their perspective to the story. The emergency room nurse who had first received Sophie spoke about her initial confusion giving way to admiration. The security guard admitted his assumptions had been completely wrong. Dr. Roberts shared his professional observation. "In medicine, we're trained to look beyond the surface to find what really matters, the heart beating beneath the skin, the life that needs saving." Today, this young girl taught us all a lesson about doing exactly that. The story ran in the next morning's paper, but it didn't stop there. Local television stations picked it up, touched by the simple truth it represented. They came with cameras and microphones, but what they captured wasn't just interviews, it was genuine moments between two families who had created something special. The hospital administration took notice too. They organized a small ceremony to recognize Maria's quick thinking and bravery. But when the hospital director tried to present her with a certificate, Maria insisted on sharing the moment with Mrs. Anderson and Sophie. "I just did what neighbors are supposed to do," she said, somewhat embarrassed by all the attention. "Anyone would have done the same thing." But everyone knew that wasn't quite true. In a world where people often hesitate to get involved, where differences sometimes create barriers, Maria's actions stood out as a powerful example of pure human compassion. The nurses who had been present during the emergency created a scrapbook, filling it with photos and notes from that day. For Sophie, they wrote inside the cover, so she'll know the story of how her brave neighbor saved her life. Mrs. Anderson's eyes filled with tears when they presented it to her. "This will help me teach her what really matters in life," she said, holding Sophie close. "Not what people look like on the outside, but what they carry in their hearts." The media attention brought unexpected results. Other residents of Pine Grove Apartments began sharing their own stories of neighborly kindness. The building manager started a community newsletter to highlight these connections. Local community groups reached out, wanting to learn how to foster similar bonds in their own neighborhoods. But for Maria and her family, nothing really changed. They continued their Sunday dinners with Mrs. Anderson and Sophie. Maria still helped with babysitting, now even more confident in her abilities. The vegetable garden on their balcony flourished, providing fresh ingredients for shared meals. "People keep calling me a hero," Maria told her mother one evening as they walked home from visiting Mrs. Anderson and Sophie in the hospital. "But I don't feel like one. I just feel like us." Her mother squeezed her hand. Sometimes, she said wisely, the biggest heroes are the ones who don't know they're being heroic. They just do what's right because that's who they are. As the story spread, it touched something deep in people's hearts. A reminder that in the simplest acts of kindness, in looking past differences to see the humanity we share, we find our truest selves. In the end, it wasn't just about a young girl who saved a baby's life. It was about the family we choose, the connections we make, and the love that knows no boundaries. In the months following the dramatic events at Atlanta General Hospital, the ripple effects of Maria's actions continued to spread throughout the community. The story had touched something deep in people's hearts, sparking conversations and changes that went far beyond that one emergency room encounter. Pine Grove Apartments, once just another residential building in the city, transformed into a model of community connection. The building manager, inspired by Maria and Mrs. Anderson's story, organized monthly resident gatherings in the common room. People who had lived next door to each other for years without speaking began sharing meals, stories, and friendship. It's amazing what can happen when we just open our doors to each other, Maria's mother observed one evening, watching children of various backgrounds playing together in the building's small playground. Her new baby, now 3 months old, slept peacefully in her arms while Sophie, fully recovered, toppled around with the other children. Mrs. Anderson, who had initially moved to Atlanta feeling isolated and alone, found herself at the center of a warm community. Her experience with diabetes had led her to start a support group for other residents managing chronic conditions. They met weekly in the community room, sharing advice, encouragement, and often home-cooked meals. When I first moved here, I was so focused on our differences, Mrs. Anderson admitted during one of these meetings. Now I realize those differences make our community stronger. We all bring something unique to share. The hospital staff who had witnessed Maria's brave actions that day remained touched by the experience. Dr. Roberts used the story in his talks to medical students, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond first impressions and assumptions. Medicine isn't just about treating symptoms, he would tell them. It's about seeing the whole person, understanding their story, their connections, their community. The emergency room nurse who had initially doubted Maria's story started a program called Neighborhood Heroes, encouraging young people to learn basic first aid and emergency response skills. Maria was invited to speak at their first meeting, though she still insisted she had only done what anyone would do. Local schools picked up the story as well, incorporating it into discussions about community, compassion, and breaking down barriers. Students wrote essays about their own experiences with unexpected friendships and moments of connection across apparent differences. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were the smallest ones, the daily interactions that showed how deeply the lesson had been absorbed. Like the elderly resident who now offered to watch children in the building's playground, or the college student who helped tutor younger kids in math and science. Maria and Sophie's friendship continued to grow stronger. The little girl who had once been a sick baby in Maria's arms now followed her around like a shadow, much to everyone's delight. Their different appearances meant nothing to them. They were simply family. You know what I love most about our building now? Maria asked one Sunday evening, as families gathered for their weekly community dinner in the courtyard. Nobody thinks it's strange anymore when people who look different act like family. The local media occasionally checked back in, doing follow-up stories on what they called the Pine Grove effect. They found that the impact had spread beyond just one apartment building. Other communities were implementing similar programs, focusing on building connections rather than highlighting differences. Mrs. Anderson, now fully recovered and managing her diabetes with support from her neighbors, often reflected on how close she had come to losing everything that day. But instead, she would say, "I gained a whole family I never expected." The story became part of Atlanta's community lore, not just as a tale of heroism, but as a reminder of what's possible when people choose to see beyond surface differences. It wasn't always easy. Prejudices and assumptions don't disappear overnight, but the example set by a 12-year-old girl and a baby had shown a better way forward.